Great. We hope everybody enjoyed that video, and thank you, Johanna, for the introduction there. I'd like to now turn the floor over to Simon Giles, who is with Accenture. Simon, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Joanna, for introducing the concept and the paper that we were writing earlier. So, if it's over the next half an hour, I'll run through the main outcomes of the paper and the observations that we made during the course of the analysis. And I'll try and leave 15 or so minutes at the end to do some Q&A. What I've tried to do in this presentation is summarize the key findings in each of the areas to be as clear and concise as possible. What I haven't done is gone into the details of the case studies, but there are a whole series of case studies available throughout the paper. We can maybe talk a little bit about the case studies in the Q&A, but I would definitely refer people into the paper to look at the case studies. As Joanna said, this was an evidence-based exercise where we went out and interviewed many of the key pilots in the industry and most of the critical players. So it is certainly an evidence-based exercise. But I refer you to the paper for those case studies. So as Joanna said, this paper was a follow-on to a 2009 paper where the focus of the exercise was really to look at the barriers to investment. And what became obvious through that piece was that the fiscal stimulus was starting to flow, and as a consequence, the funding was available to execute against pilots, especially in the US, but also out in Asia and in Australia, and increasingly in Europe as well. So the focus transitioned quite quickly to trying to identify from the initial pilots what were the lessons learned and how could we apply that more broadly. So I think one of the things that's certainly worth summarizing is what the three key findings that came out of the last 12 to 18 months. And we really observed three key themes that were evolving. The first was that we were starting to see that regional archetypes were developing. And by that, I mean, if you look at projects that are occurring in the US, in Europe, and in Asia, we started to see quite different themes. For example, in Asia, it's an extremely dynamic environment, and what we saw was that smart grid was becoming part of a broader industrial strategy on the behalf of the likes of China and Japan and Korea, where national champions such as Panasonic and Toshiba and LG and Samsung were getting a level of support for developing products that could be operating in the smart grid space with a specific guide to export. So, for example, in Japan, METI, which is one of the government agencies that specifically focused on developing foreign export, were developing 4 city-based pilot programs in smart grid, specifically targeted at developing products with the likes of Toshiba, TEPCO, and Panasonic. Now, that's quite different to what we saw in Europe, where we certainly have more of a carbon-based and low-carbon-based approach, where smart grid programs are focused on enabling a broader low-carbon economy and driving carbon savings. And that results in quite a different focus for the pilots and the projects. So the focus was very much around dealing with intermittency of renewables and enabling EV charging infrastructure and other low-carbon technologies. Whereas in the US, the focus has been somewhat more practical and prosaic and around grid reliability, cost of the consumer, energy security, and yet at the same time there is a drive to try and develop national champions and an export capacity. But from a utility perspective and from a regulatory perspective, the focus was very much on driving improvements in reliability and consumer engagement. The second focus that we've seen is that the sets have become larger and that cities have become a catalyst. So going back maybe 2 or 3 years, the focus was very much on the transition from AMR to AMI. And then we saw the set get larger as we transitioned into the smart grid space. And now we're starting to see the inclusion of the Internet of Things and intelligent infrastructure. So the set of products and services that are being linked into a smart grid is getting larger. The other thing that we start to see in cities is that the focus is on pilots around cities because of the level of concentration of the stakeholder base, but also the introduction of other funding opportunities. Also, we see a concentration of the costs and benefits within a city just due to the density of the habitation within the city. So that seems to be a trend that continues, and that's a global trend that we're seeing. We're seeing the same thing happen in Europe, Asia, and the US, and the focus on the cities. The final observation, broad observation, was around the new entrants to the value chain, and I would kind of split that into two parts. The first part is that we're seeing the heavy hitters come to the table in a way that maybe they hadn't done three or 4 years ago, with kind of more of the introduction of GE, Cisco, and Siemens and companies of that stature. And as a consequence, that drives energy into the industry as a whole, and much more focus on development of R&D type projects. And you only need to look at the GE competitions that have been set up recently, and the amount of investment that are being made by the likes of Siemens and Cisco into the smart grid space. But also we're starting to see emerging players on the Asian side like Huawei and Samsung that maybe hadn't been playing in this space before but are now very firmly at the table, and as I said before, are backed by national government. The final piece is that we're certainly starting to see retail-focused companies coming to the table. They're probably still characterized as in an observation role. There are a few examples of where the big retail-focused companies, both in terms of consumer products but industrial products as well, are starting to be involved in programs and look at both the home area network and home automation as a potential area to get involved in. I think that trend will certainly continue as we go through the next year or two, and I expect to see the likes of the Best Buys and the Targets of the world coming to the table in a more structured way. In the paper, we go into the detail of the various strategies that we're seeing emerging in more detail. I know that it's hard to see on this slide, but in the paper itself, there's a full-page breakdown of the type of archetypes that we see emerging in different places and the dynamics that are involved in that. So in terms of summarizing the observations from the first round of pilots that we've seen and then the challenges going forward into the next round of pilots, I think the summary is that there's somewhat of a regulatory unease out there, and that's not something that's specific to any given market, but I guess a generalization. And part of that is driven by the fact that business cases remain somewhat fragile, and that is purely because we're not basing those on experiential empirical data. There's still a lot of assumptions that are being fed into the business cases, and we haven't really got a good load of data to double check against the business case assumptions that are coming through. That's not to say there isn't any data, but certainly there isn't the depth of data that maybe we would like to see as utilities and participants in the industry. The second is that there is still a level of legislative and policy uncertainty, and that makes investors nervous. When we're making very long-term investments, without clear statements of policy, there remains a level of ambiguity and nervousness to invest. We still see some residual concerns over data privacy, security, interoperability, and standards. I'll come back to that topic in a bit more detail later, and it's not insurmountable. The fourth section there is about conflation of objectives, and it's a slightly strange term, I know, and I'll come into it in more detail, but what we've started to see is this clash of objectives within the pilot between technology testing, operating model testing, and business model testing. And trying to unwind cause and effect has been quite difficult. And we've seen some cases where business models have been changed, but maybe the results have been muddied by the fact that the consumers have rejected technology, and therefore it's very difficult to unwind cause and effect. And coming from that are some examples of consumer backlash, and there is a risk that has set back the industry. But I think a lot more is potentially being made of that than is potentially the case, and it certainly shouldn't hold us back going forward. So going forward, what are the challenges that we're trying to address? And the first is to create a broader set of empirical value cases, and I specifically use the case value cases rather than business cases, because I think that there's certainly an opportunity to broaden the scope of how we create business cases to include more intangible benefits that aren't necessarily reflected in monetary terms, but deliver societal value, and if they were to be monetized, would improve the business case, and we'll talk a bit about that going forward. And second is to create an open dialogue with policymakers on the funding requirements. Fiscal stimulus is not going to be around forever, and these investments will need to stand on their own feet, and that requires a level of engagement with policymakers and regulators to change the game. More rapid progress on standards. We've seen a lot of progress over the last 12 months, but that needs to continue going forward to make utilities more confident on investing without stranding assets or technology obsolescence. We need to see more business and operating model innovation within the pilots, and that's a natural progression as the technology becomes more stable. We expect to see more examples of standard enterprise architectures and reference models as the technology matures and we get more experience of implementing these types of projects. And I would certainly expect to see standard enterprise architectures becoming more the norm. And then finally, there needs to be a very clear focus on the consumer experience. And if we get all those things right, then we'll have a much more solid base for the transition to mass rollout, and we can move beyond the pilot stage into mass rollout, which is what everyone wants.